So the last part of this chapter really addressed, to the extent that there are differences, where do they come from? So this is getting at the heart of, the observable differences, which may or may not be real. Where do they even come from? And this nature versus nurture argument. And so when it comes to nature versus nurture, nature, also called naturalism, also called biological determinism, versus nurture, also called culturalism, also called differential socialization. So basically, are we born with these differences, or, are we taught them? Do we learn them through socialization, our families, our schools, and larger society? So which of these ideologies do the authors support? Trick question. They reject both of them. And instead, and they reject both of them because they're like, both of them are an incomplete explanation. Instead, the argument that they put forth is that it's about biocultural intersection. So first of all, let's talk about why we have to talk about culture. It is society that makes us human. And we know society makes us like, yeah, you're born a human baby, right? You're not born a puppy. You're not born a lion cub. You're not born a tadpole. But when you think about human behavior, human characteristics, that isn't innate in humans the way it is in other animals. We do have to be taught. And we know we have to be taught because we can look at examples of what happens when that doesn't occur. We have examples of that historically through feral children that have been found in the wild, who literally just more or less reverted back to kind of like animalistic behavior. Isolated children. A very good example of that is the story of Jeannie. Jeannie was basically kept locked in a dark bedroom with no human interaction up until the age of 12 years old, when she was discovered. And at age 12, when researchers kind of took over her care, what they discovered is there is a time limit. If we miss the window of socialization, we miss the window of making you human. They were able to teach Jeannie, some basic words, but her verbal, her language, as well as quantitative skills, were always very stunted. And perhaps more important, morally, it was some just moral retardation there. And what I mean by that is, as 2, 3, 4-year-olds, when we learn to respect other people's property and keep hands, feet, and objects to ourselves, and we learn to be honest and it's wrong to lie, when we learn how to be a good friend, when we learn how to control our impulses so we don't, violently lash out at people, we had to learn that because all of that goes against animal nature. Getting Jeannie at age 12, what researchers found is that those were very hard things for her to teach. For her to learn at that age. And isolated children, still exist. We've also learned that, even if they're not completely isolated, institutionalized children who don't receive enough care or love, particularly from their kind of primary caretaker, in most cases, that's supposed to be a parent, that they also kind of experience this kind of stunted human development. And so, a story like Jeannie complicates the idea of a female brain, right? Doesn't matter that she was born female. All of those things that, people say exist in the female brain, the empathy, the nurturing, none of that matters when you are not correctly socialized, when you aren't, in fact, still taught how to be a human. So just emphasizes that a lot of that isn't hardwired in. We have to learn it. But at the same time, and this is why the authors aren't just like pro-culturalism, they remind us it is only through our bodies that we encounter our social world. So, our bodies, our genes, the stuff that is encoded there, that is important. And so what they want you to think about is that, it's like a rectangle. Humans are like rectangles. A rectangle, you take the length, you take the width, and you multiply. Human beings, you take our nature, you take our nurture, you take biology, you take cultural, social influences, and those things intersect in order to make us who we are. And so, we see this in a lot of ways. We see this in gene environment interactions, that some genes, the likelihood that they're going to be expressed, have a lot to do with the environment people are raised in. One popular example of that comes out is, the so-called sociopath gene, which is actually like a cluster of traits: impulsivity, lack of conscience, not consciousness, conscience, lack of conscience, as well as aggression, right? You have the makings of a sociopath. But if you're born in a supportive household with parents who love you and support you and work on ways for you to help control your impulses and your anger issues, then those children did not grow up to express those characteristics, versus children that grew up in violent or cold, unloving, non-supportive homes. Another good example of gene environment interactions are identical twins who are adopted and raised in separate homes. They start off with, yes, in terms of genotype, pretty much identical. So they should be the exact same regardless of how they're raised, but that's found to not be true. And actually, we call this twin studies. Twin studies are a very popular way for researchers to try to determine how much of something is nature versus how much of something is nurture. Because if identical twins raised in separate homes wind up behaving very similar when it comes to a characteristic, like, I don't know, introversion, then they might say, okay, that characteristic has a very strong genetic underpinning. But if they wind up acting very differently on that characteristic, and they were raised in different homes, then, it tells us that maybe environment matters more. We've already talked about the hormonal feedback loop, right? A way in which something that's biological, like your hormones, interact with the environment and the context, right? And they can make, in the case of testosterone, right, how you behave, the situations you find yourself in, if you're having to constantly call upon that fight or flight response, engaging in aggressive behavior, this can kind of change your hormonal makeup. And then this section also talks about just the role of society in general. Going back to those differences in strength, muscular arms, the extent to which males and females vary on muscularity, especially in the arms, has a lot to do with, what messages are they getting from their society? If you live in a society that makes it totally acceptable for women to do push-ups on their knees, beginning at, as young girls, if you can still get a presidential physical fitness badge without doing a pull-up, that was me, then it's like, why would you then be expected to have muscular arms or have this arm strength as an adult woman? But in societies where, there isn't not this societal acceptance around this distinction, not to say that women develop arms just as muscular as men's, but it's worth noting that the size of the distinction, the size of the difference is diminished. A good example of a country like that is Israel, where everyone is required to serve in the military. And so for that reason, they don't have this kind of dramatically different physical fitness expectations for their women. So they have a society where much more of their young women can do push-ups on the toes and do pull-ups. In our own society, if we look at marathon times, it used to be believed that women should not run marathons. It was thought to be bad for their fertility, their uterus. And so, men ran marathons. And so women didn't start running until much later. And that picture is a picture of the first woman that ran in the Boston Marathon. She actually, disguised herself. And then when it became clear she was a woman, you see they tried to like physically, pull her off the course, kick her out of the race. But what's interesting is, yes, men still run faster marathons than women, but that gap is closing so quickly, not just even among the fastest men and women, but even average male and female marathon times. And so, as you kind of look and see how, the gap is starting to close, you can maybe imagine that there might be a future where it more or less disappears. And then the final example that your book talks about in terms of role of society is like bone density, that something that we might think is biological still can be very mutable based on a given society. And so here they were talking about particularly about young Jewish boys. In this case, because they spend so much time studying, that they are not able, and this is ultra-Orthodox Jewish adolescent boys, because they're expected to spend so much time on their books versus exercising. They spend so much more time indoors. Their bones never grow as strong as even their sisters. And so, this is something that, once again, that's the role of society, right? If you just looked at the difference, you might be like, oh, maybe it's biological, but really it's social. And then, of course, once again, going back to, your brain is what you do with it, in that Tetris example. And the other reason why they emphasize this kind of biocultural intersection is because of intersectionality and difference, right? The fact of the matter is gender is only one identity that intersects with our other social identities. And so this is important because, yes, there might be some biological differences between males and females, but those differences get filtered through life experiences that are shaped and influenced by our other identities. And so specifically, like that case of the bone density, a biological aspect of Orthodox Jewish boys, a specific culture, specific gender identity. And so, the quote from 6061, when men and women share other identities and life experiences, those things bring the sexes together, producing even physical similarities as our complex bodies respond to shared cultural environments. So, our gender identity is not our only important identity. And so, how we express certain things, how we experience certain things, also is also relevant to these other identities we have, like race, like religion, like class, like ability, education level. And then finally, your book looks at evolutionary theory basically just to poo-poo it. And that's because, evolutionary theory, every couple, keyword here is theory. A lot of this is not research supported because it doesn't exist. So, evolutionary theory often makes hypotheses, often makes arguments based on, what they know about the sexes now and why they think we evolved that way. So it's like working backwards. It definitely doesn't fit the research model at all. And it's no really way to test it because we've evolved the way that we've evolved. So they reject evolutionary theory, and they explain that, a couple of reasons why they reject it is a lot of evolutionary theory asserts that the nuclear family is natural, but there's a lot of anthropological, archaeological evidence that disproves this, that for a lot of human history, kin groups were the building blocks of society, not nuclear families. And this is important because, if there's no nuclear family, there's no head of the household. And so unsurprisingly, a lot of these early hunting gathering societies, based on evidence that we have, were relatively egalitarian. And although evolutionary theory focuses on the ways in which we supposedly evolved to be different, the authors posit that the opposite's probably true. We probably evolved to have more similarities than differences, because it would have been maladaptive to have these kind of separate spheres based on sex in a society where you could possibly lose a lot of women and a lot of men, right? That, whether it's due to war, whether it's due to pregnancy, whether it's due to illness, it would have been maladaptive to human survival to have a lot of things that only males did versus only females, that instead males and females did a lot of the same things in these early societies. And so that's true even just considering something like child rearing or sexuality, comparative to, later periods in society. There was much greater sexual tolerance of homosexuality, as well as extramarital sex, to the extent that marriage existed, in any form. And that's because, a lot of focus on marriage and a lot of focus on female sexuality has a lot to do with paternity, right? The idea that property needs to be left to legitimate children. But in these forager societies, tribal children belong to the entire tribe. And of course, a lot of these societies did not have private property. So it didn't really matter if somebody, the saying, mama's baby, daddy's maybe. It did not matter in these societies whether you were only daddy's maybe. In societies, later societies, as we started to focus more on private property and separate spheres and, men as being the head of the household, a lot of the kind of, especially for women, a lot of the kind of strict limits that were placed on female sexuality and regulations around female sexuality was because of concerns about, how will we know whose baby this is? Because, of course, Maury did not exist to tell people whether or not they were the daddy that fit. This wasn't a concern in these early theories. And so the kind of final point that they break down from the evolutionary theorists has to do with this plenty of seed to sow. You might have heard some people say like, men weren't meant to be monogamous. That's why they have so much sperm, but women have limited eggs. And they just kind of point out that this just isn't supported by evidence. That, yes, men have a lot of sperm and women have limited eggs, but there has never been a society that's just had unlimited women for men to impregnate, just in terms of age and society size, and the fact that in most societies, some level of incestual relationships were largely frowned upon in a lot of societies. So they're just like, so that's another evolutionary argument that to the authors just falls flat. And so they kind of end with the point that while gender has mattered in pretty much all societies, how and why it's mattered in terms of how people organize their lives and tasks has varied. And once again, remember that, we do have this research gap because of weird. And so, the final kind of points I want to make, the book has this great quote: "There's always an easy solution to every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong." And so when we revisit the question, are there real differences between men and women? The book just warns us to, be aware of deceptive differences, that these things that we think of as being real differences between males and females, ask yourself, do they meet those four definitions, or really just that fourth definition, biological and immutable? And if the answer is no, then regardless of what we might see, observe difference, that this is, in fact, a deceptive difference, probably based a lot more on society and learned differences than real differences between the sexes. And so the answer to that question, biology has us on a leash, but it's very, very long. The gender binary that characterizes men and women as opposite sexes isn't reflected in the science. And fails to do justice to what we know about human biology and history. Moreover, what differences we do find are also shaped by life experiences that are not centrally about gender. So for the most part, like I said, this whole chapter was just a very long explanation based on evidence, that we are not opposite sexes. We are a species that has low sexual dimorphism, and regardless of what the binary would encourage us to think, what society at different time periods has encouraged us to think by emphasizing deceptive differences, male and female bodies are not that dramatically different.